This is a continuation, sort of the previous statements about, or the previous series about, like an intro to Buddhism, and how I was going to take a separate section to do to focus on Vajrayana, the esoteric Buddhist sort of school. And I've kind of decided to bring in a couple of other things. So it's going to be a kind of wide-ranging discussion. It's not going to be strictly about Vajrayana, but also about the tantric aspects of Vajrayana, which are just good to know because Tantra is a lot about confronting the left-hand path and the left-hand elements in life. And alchemy is also about taking these lower elements and then transmuting them, refining them, processing them in such a way that they become finer and rarer. And of course, that's the concept in alchemy and in Tantra, that all things, no matter how seemingly corrupt, contain that essential essence, right? You might say Buddha nature if you were in Buddhism, or maybe Christ nature if you were a Christian. I mean, it kind of depends on what lens you're using. Well, anyway, let's just back up a little bit and kind of start at the beginning. So, like, what is meant by right hand versus left hand path? There's a couple of ways to parse this. It's not really as simple as like good and evil. When you come to like an occult understanding of things, evil is basically something that used to be good or arguably will be good, but is out of place in time, either anticipating something too soon or being held too late in time. And that's, I mean, it is still fights against progress in the area you're in. It's just that you understand that what is evil is always a lens. And so it's not really correct to think of the left-hand path as like evil, because of course, like Satan, quote unquote, or I mean, it's really Lucifer, but in the case of like Satanism or whatever, right? The devil brought freedom in addition to other things. Like we fell, but we also fell into the ability to make our own decisions, even though those decisions were based on a corrupt understanding of the world. It was still like our decision to make. So then ideally you take this freedom that you gained and then combine it with a correct understanding, like spiritual understanding of the world, and then you've redeemed that fall, or that, you know, corruption, as it were. But I'm getting a little bit off. It's just that there are elements about the left-hand path that are like legitimate, because in a sense the left-hand path is the old path, in a sense like the pre-Christian path, and it has to exist as a ground against which like other paths push. So it's like a question of, you know, in a certain sense, right-hand path is dependent on the left-hand path for its existence. So you can't really do without this. There's a certain necessity of this, and people will follow it, and it's like, you know, correct to do so. So it's like not from a place of judgment where I call something left-handed or right-handed path. And of course, as you'll see, that concept, in a certain sense, can be and should be transcended by the modern occultist, with caution, you know, and due care. But to split it a certain way, you could say that the left-hand path regards being, just being, that you know, the core existence phenomenon as the grounds of existence, like being itself and the bestowals that come with being, essentially the divinity that comes with it, are a self-justification. And so like the selfishness that comes from the left-hand path is basically leaning into that, leaning into all the inherent powers that are given to you in existence, you know, and is, you know, again, associated with lesser practices, because you know, there's danger in terms of egotism and delusion. Generally speaking, the traps that you run into are always traps that you yourself generate at some point. Occultists are constantly dealing with egotism rising up and coming up, because as you start to cut away various delusions, you see like just how much of an egotist you really are under the surface, and it becomes quite overwhelming sometimes. And it's a constant struggle, and it's like once you think you've cleared it away and you come to like a new level of understanding, as soon as you're given more responsibility, then you have egotism to deal with again. It's like the occultist's occultist's flaw, if you will. And egotism is usually what leads people to distortions. The left-hand path kind of leans into that whole complex. And I can't say like a tremendous amount about it because I have only ever engaged in like alchemical paths, which seek to bring sort of almost like the left hand and the right hand together, which we'll get into later. But if the left-hand path has being as its final justification, then the right hand has love as its sort of like ground state of being, which is interesting because in a certain sense it's by definition an evolution. Originally being was all there was. Love was a relationship that had to arise as a result of being, beings coming into relationship with one another. It's an evolution, right? And so again, it's not incorrect to think there's sort of a historical evolution represented by the right-hand path over the left, but to consider it as like superior, or to consider that the other paths are therefore unnecessary, is to not really understand the interrelatedness of these things. Like the new traditions can't exist without the soil of the old traditions to grow in. Although that makes certain metaphors about decomposition of the old traditions interesting, right? So you got being on the left hand and love on the right hand. And so I think that we can talk now about the eighth sphere, which is something that people throw around a lot. And I'm not going to really get into like intense definitions now, especially because different people really regard it differently. But I think it's safe to say that, essentially there is a place where you can come to wisdom of a sort. And it's actually really easy to run into in all kinds of circumstances. It has an analogy to like the lowest level of the Akashic record, which is just sort of like a chaotic jumble of all the information in the universe. It's not like morally sorted, and it's almost not even like causally sorted. It just sort of exists in a jumble, right? It's kind of like the underworld. And that in itself like contributes to a sort of a distorted or lesser belt of illusions or delusions, which like are forms of wisdom but are not connected to like the most true forms of wisdom for this time. Like it's really hard to describe what I'm saying. It's like I'm wondering why I'm even attempting to. I should probably come back to this a little bit more when I have some refresher on it. The Unknown Friend talks about this. But aside from like defining some particular area, eighth sphere or belt, let's just stick to the idea that there are different kinds of wisdom. Okay, there are like more exalted and less exalted forms of wisdom, and there is wisdom that comes from a desire to seek power. There's wisdom that comes from a desire to serve. Like it comes in multifaceted forms. And so what can define the right-hand path, right, is the pleasure of wisdom. So what do I mean by that? If you've had like any occult study type activity and you've worked on a problem for a long time, or like a setting, or you've puzzled over some relationship between two spirits or entities or whatever, and you've been working on it, and then it clicks, and you have a new understanding that is alive for you, and you realize that it explains several things or fits into your life in a certain way, there is a pleasure that comes from that. And it's like a fairly rarefied one, right? It's like a spiritual kind of thing. But that is a pleasure that's safe. Because it is a pleasure that comes from interacting with like genuine wisdom, like struggling through to this kind of pleasure requires a great deal of exertion, and it's kind of like a safeguard against it being too overwhelmingly powerful, because like it's definitely a pleasurable experience, sometimes very intensely so, but there's no way that you would engage in that kind of work for the purpose of seeking pleasure, because it just doesn't work like that. So the right-hand path is very safe for that reason, because your only path to these moments of intense blissful revelation is along a place where the wisdom comes first, and your comprehension, your illumination is what is going to allow you to experience those things. So it's like it's safe, right? And that's the best thing about it, is that it's completely safe. It doesn't care if it takes you 10 times longer, as long as you get there in the end. And so it's really easy to recommend to people because there's no danger. But it also requires more enthusiasm, more effort, and more just general application of will, because it's not going to give you quick and easy answers. It requires a lot of contemplation, like the activity, which is a form of meditation, although it is way easier and way more appealing than a lot of the more focused types. But it doesn't really require any less will. And it certainly requires paying a great deal of attention, because revelations in the form of contemplation often come way outside of when you're actually like contemplating them. It might be at some other point in the day, but that's true of like meditation in general. So on the other hand, right, the left-hand path is more about the wisdom that comes from pleasure. So there is a wisdom that can be extracted from pleasure states, but it is distorted, because pleasure has a distorting effect on people that have not like purified the egotistical qualities of it, the ways that it binds you to like your physical form and such. And so the left-hand path always has this risk of distortion and corruption. But there is still there is legitimate wisdom there, but it's sort of wisdom that's been sealed off from the light. It's in the middle of like the Ouroboros. There's no like Sabbath to it, so it's distorted, it's darkened. Now that makes it a wonderful candidate for like redemption, shadow work, and stuff. It's not like it's without value, but I would argue it's of value for people doing more advanced work, people that are building up their repertoire of their storage of like spiritual energy with meditative exercises and working on other things. Like it's best to kind of leave that stuff to the experienced types until later. And then of course that's why the right-hand path is there. So you have something to work on without worry. I mean, you have to actually follow what it says. So personally, I'm also involved with esoteric Buddhism, particularly a tantric path. But I don't know that that's like a necessity. The thing is, my history with esoteric Buddhism is super complicated. I'm going to try to give it in like a quick form. But essentially, the Buddha always appealed to me, even as a child, like 13, 12, whatever. I would read the teachings and I'd be like, oh, this is pretty sensible stuff. Even if I didn't have like an exact grasp of what enlightenment was, it just, these things are karmic. You have attraction to wisdom because of seeds planted out of like the spirit world. I mean, things you get led about by the nose sometimes. Other times it's like a mystery. But for me, the pull to Buddhism in general has always been very strong. The Buddha was, in a sense, like my first spiritual teacher. But I never really did much with it, though. Just I kind of, I probably did very little like meditation or whatever. I never really had the knack for the mind stilling type meditation. It's just really not really my bag. I've gotten better at it though. But then I took Japanese in college for reasons I won't even go into. But while I was visiting Japan in a study abroad situation, I went to Koyasan, which is a center of Shingon Buddhism in Japan. I had no idea that esoteric Buddhism existed, none. I probably had maybe heard of Mahayana or whatever, and in my Japanese class I'd seen stuff about Tendai, which is mostly Mahayana with a smidge of Vajrayana esoteric practices for certain very crazy monks. if they want to try to get some status in this lifetime, but I'm pretty sure monks have actually died doing this. I won't go into that either. That's a discussion for another time. There's a great documentary on it. It's like the walking monks of Tendai or whatever. They do this amazing circuit around the mountain like every morning. It's great. Anyway, Shingon Buddhism, and the iconography of the spirits, which had the esoteric Buddhism has even more of a sort of Indian flair to it, with the dakinis and the wisdom kings and such. It has more of that sort of deva look to it, which is actually very strange from the point of view of ordinary Theravada Buddhism. Like, you would just kind of be like, don't engage with those delusions. Like, that's just a product of mind or whatever. Like, get out of that stuff, right? So it's there are many reasons why I feel like Theravada Buddhists would be suspicious of esoteric Buddhism, and like from their point of view, rightfully so. But to me, just that imagery was like, I saw Fudo Myo, right, Achala, the main wisdom king of Shingon, the wrathful form of Mahavairochana. I didn't know any of this at the time, but just I'm like, wow, this guy, like, what's up with this guy? Something about it really spoke to me, and all of the esoteric Buddhist iconography, especially because we got to go inside like the main meditation hall in Koyasan and see like the actual mandala and the various statues, and we were taken through by this really cool German monk. When a foreigner there is very much a rarity. You have to be very dedicated to be a foreign monk, and you got to learn Japanese and stuff. It's there. It can be done, and it speaks to this guy's dedication. He was very excited. He really was like a gateway for me, and we were there for this once a year thing they do for 3 days every October. They do like a lay initiation into the Diamond Mandala. They also have one for the Moon Mandala in the spring, which I have not attended and probably never will attend. But it's supposed to kind of like get you into the stream of the Buddhas in some way. And so it is the only esoteric initiation I've ever had. And on the one hand, it's technically initiation into Mahavairochana, who's like the supreme cosmic Buddha. And so to the extent that that's effective, it probably gives you the favor of a lot of different Buddha streams at the same time, like hopefully all of them, including whatever ones that I've run into myself. So it's almost just like I got a little push, but no kind of like monk ordination or anything. But it was very eventful for me, and the Diamond Mandala and the Moon Mandala, and just I got really into Kukai's theory, the founder of it, and I read all about him, and I studied his life. The life of Kukai would make an amazing side video anyway, because I mean, just what a Chad. The story of how he plucked esoteric Buddhism in this OG form away from China before it just completely all collapsed. I mean, if you don't believe in like karma and destiny, you just read about this guy's life and you're just like, wow. He was definitely like a initiate serving all of the people of Japan with all the things that he accomplished. And he also, besides that, was one of the 3 great calligraphers of Japan. And he preserved the Sanskrit and stuff. I mean, I'm not going to go into the specific history of Shingon now because I actually am relatively familiar with it. And it is super fascinating. And the history of it itself, I mean, the reason why, I don't have the book with me, but this amazing book by Yoshitoku Hakeda, it's all of Kukai's best stuff, like that's possible to be like condensed, and it gives you a wonderful picture of the man. It's got like a mini biography, all of his most important ideas, his philosophies. It is a tour de force. I relied on that for my little like thesis that I wrote while I was in Japan. But essentially, it's almost like the man himself and his amazingly intellectual explanations. I mean, I think he was around in the 900s, and he's very modern. I mean, he lays it all out in a very sensible way. And despite, and of course the inner aspect of it, but he basically explains like why mantras work and stuff in a very comprehensible way. I mean, he was just a genius. And due to this practice he had with the Akashagarbha mantra before he ever went to China, he was like incredibly gifted with languages, which is probably part of the reason why he had that calligraphic ability, because he could write Sanskrit and all the Chinese characters, and so I mean he could write Japanese characters, they were the same, but there's more in China, a lot more. So that was basically, and I was interested in mantras and everything, but I only just had dalliances with it up to when I moved with essentially my wife into my current situation, not like here, but starting a family with her. And as a practice, I picked up doing mantras. Now, because I was never initiated into any practice, I basically had to just, I mean, technically I was given one mantra, which is, I'm not, it's, well, so I don't want to go into this, but in Japanese, they can't do Sanskrit syllables. And so Kukai had to figure out a way to transliterate whatever he could into Japanese and still make it effective. And I mean, I guess it is. I don't doubt that it is. But it's considerably different from the Sanskrit. I used to just do the Japanese transliteration, but it's like, no, dude, you should learn the Sanskrit because you speak English, and hence you're not going to be, you can do all the vowels, right? So the Mahavairochana, well, no, it's actually the 6 elements. I mean, it's associated with Mahavairochana. It was the 6 elements mantra, which is well, in Japanese, it was onnabira ungen mazara datoban, onnabira ungen mazara datoban. And so for this initiation, they had us blindfolded and holding like a lotus flower as we got led in, and then we'd toss onto the mandala, which is what they would do for a real abhiseka for a monk. And in fact, I guess they do this for monks. It's just that they keep going and doing other stuff, and also they tell you where your lotus landed instead of just being like, generically, it landed in the middle, just like it did for Kukai. It's like, oh, it didn't. But and even if it did, what the hell would that mean at this point, right? Anyways, it was all a very like esoteric experience. I mean, it obviously had a long-term effect on me. But when I decided to start an esoteric Buddhist practice, I just adapted what I could from the lay traditions that I could get a hold of. I mean, they have like a 13 Buddhas thing, and I was doing that. And I studied some other stuff, but it's kind of a closed book for like I said, for people that aren't willing to live there and study Japanese. And I mean, I know a little Japanese, but it's, fading. And so, over time, I've kind of drifted over towards the Tibetan practices as well. I'm not going to go into the historical divide, but like technically the Japanese esoteric Buddhism is much older than what exists in Tibet now. There have been all kinds of like much, by our standards, much more relatively recent updates, like 1400s, 1600s, 1800s. Like they're ongoing. Shingon's very much been, I mean, there's been stuff happening. I'm not that familiar with it. I mean, there's been offshoots and stuff, but the essential temple, I think, has been the same as long as it can be, with whatever adaptations it has to make. But I have had to adapt also some Tibetan things, because, like I said, I could only penetrate to this like lay level. And as far as like mantras and stuff go, like, if there's a publicly available mantra, I don't really think there's any problem with you just trying it out. A student of like genuine esoteric Buddhism, not me, not like a rogue guy, but like somebody who's in a tradition. I mean, they're really of the opinion that these secret mantras it's just dangerous to use them. None of these public mantras I've ever come across seem like they could be dangerous, with the possible exception of the Vajrayogini mantra, the long one. But, okay, it's out there anyway, and so what the hell are people going to do about it now? But at the same time, it's like, even, it's like if you're somebody who's karmically fated to do this, and it's going to be super effective for you, but it's just going to put you onto the path. It's not going to like corrupt you. It's just, to me, who has the patience to do something 10,000 times? Like, I don't know. It's hard for me to imagine when it's like, here's a path to power. Say this 10,000 times. Like, what the fuck is this? How is this going to help me? Like, you have to have a very strange turn of mind to try to like abuse mantras. I think maybe this is just a blind spot for me. Like, I just don't even understand how these things can be abused. But it's more than that. It's also that keeping it in a tight, like a tightly guarded thing. It gives it power too. So it's not just that. But so like, just as an example, because we're going to be talking about Tantra, this is just an example of, this is Vajrayogini, which is like the super highest Dakini, who's, I mean, like, I'm not even really going to go into everything about Vajrayogini right now, because, I mean, I have no initiations or empowerments related to Vajrayogini. Like I said, I'm basically just hacking my way in. No qualified practitioner, I think, would approve of what I'm doing necessarily. They probably would be like, dude, you need to like get on the internet and fucking take a flight out to somebody who can give you the initiations or something. I don't know. At the same time, like, this book they have like a self-initiation sadhana in there, because realistically they're like, okay, if they're publishing a book, they're taking a risk that some people are going to be able to hack this stuff on their own. Which I have had some mild success with, but it's not something that I would recommend to people. I have a lot of sort of personal reasons, and even like some personal signs that this is something that's like all right for me to be kind of dipping my toe into, because I have guidance with people, and just the Rosicrucian stuff also helps me. It's just I'm in kind of a unique situation. But if you find these things to be compelling, there's probably some reason for you to look into it, or at least have a look. What the hell is the harm in looking at something? But so this idea of like this Vajrayogini path, I'm gonna just give like this like criminally brief underscoring of what it's about, right? Or at least this is the tantric element that's interesting about it. So you learn to generate spontaneous states of bliss through certain meditations, energy exercises, breath work, visualizations. It's a fairly rigorous and involved process, but it is all like straightforward in the sense that they give you all the instructions you need to actually like pursue it. It's a lot of effort, like all of this stuff is. Again, it's like, yeah, you could give people the secret to salvation, but if it's too much work, they're just not going to fucking do it. That's really what stops people. It's not like the wisdom isn't there. It's that people don't have the sight or wisdom or will to pursue it. I mean, I had that issue for fucking ever, and it's always something that you can work on. But so you generate great bliss, right? Now, like we were saying before, there is a wisdom in pleasure. The left-hand path would be able to use bliss as a state to comprehend and understand certain things, to gain certain understandings. And that would be, in a certain sense, legitimate, but also provisional, right? And so you have great bliss on this side, and then you have an understanding of the inherent emptiness of phenomena here, and like not just an understanding, but like an incredibly firm imagination. One could even say you've reached the meditative ability to blank out your senses, like not just imagining emptiness, but almost being able to force yourself to experience it. And that's, again, the emptiness quality, right? So you have spontaneous bliss over here, and you have a sort of like learned emptiness, right? So this is the wisdom aspect, and this, or no, I guess technically this is the bliss is the wisdom aspect because it's the feminine, right? Like the experience, the form, right? Experiencing bliss, being the form of bliss, as opposed to emptiness, right? And understanding, the skillful means, the masculine. So you take these things and you put them together, right? You merge your understanding of emptiness and your experience of bliss, right? You alchemize them together. This new state of consciousness does not suffer from the delusions of the left-hand path because they have been purified by your understanding of wisdom from the right-hand path. Now, this is insanely oversimplified. This is just like a metaphor for what happens. It has nothing to do with the complicated reality and all of the trainings and mantras and stuff that goes into creating this rarefied state of consciousness. That's why people go through trainings and they have, initiations and bestowals. Like, this stuff is not a joke, right? And so, like I said, most people would say, like, you probably should get a teacher for this kind of thing. But honestly, I wouldn't be here and doing this channel if I wasn't kind of just like a multi-class. It's baked into Rosicrucianism anyway, like alchemizing things. There's going to historically be a coming together of Eastern and Western, like occultism and religious streams and stuff at some point in the future, thousands of years, I guess. And it just, people have to anticipate these things coming together. And I've been called to study these things side by side, and even to approach them in an exoteric way from the outside, and to see what progress can be made just on my own recognizance, because I'm kind of doing these things scientifically, right? I mean, the Rosicrucian is like spiritual scientist, and so, I have great faith in the Buddha and the teachings and spiritual power of Buddha and mantras and stuff, or I wouldn't be doing them all the time. It's basically my main meditative practice is these mantras. But, it's like, it depends on the person. So that tantric idea that you merge bliss and emptiness, and then you create something that transcends both, and hence you are able to use this bliss emptiness, non-dual, right, to one-pointedly comprehend certain fundamental truths about reality, and hence experience enlightenment in some form. I'm not going to say what, because what the fuck do I know? That is like the basis of Tantra, and you can see that bliss aspect, and they say that it's like in its full form, it's like 10 times as orgasmic as sex or whatever, which I don't disbelieve, because even like the little bits of it and stuff that I get are very like pleasurable. I mean, it's an energy aligning practice. I think it's related to like Kundalini and stuff, but it's, again, probably need to ask somebody that's qualified about these things. This is really more just sort of like for curiosity purposes, and if it sparks your interest, then it's like, I can signpost for you, but I would never like presume to be somebody who could do anything other than that for you. most people belong inside an esoteric tradition for a reason, and there's nothing wrong with it. It's what gives it its strength. So I'm not trying to recommend my thing to anybody else, nor do I necessarily recommend against it, just because part of the reason these mantras have gotten out is because like they are available for people to use, and if you have the will to test these things and you're willing to try doing something 10,000 times to see if there'll be an effect, like I guarantee, like you're going to notice something about it. You know, it might be subtle, but learning subtle thinking and subtle observation is like 90% of being an occultist anyway. Paying attention to your intuitions and your little hunches and stuff, and honoring how you feel in ways that you've never done before, right? It's like presence for yourself first and foremost. It's something that people actually don't really learn. I mean, I didn't fucking learn it. Who learned it? I learned it from Rudolf Steiner, like indirectly, by him fucking advising me to pay some fucking attention to what the hell was happening around me. But, yeah, I mean, I think we're just going to kind of leave it there for now. I mean, like I said, that was super wide ranging. And I'm going to leave a discussion of like the eighth sphere as such for another time, because I don't feel comfortable weighing in on that. I clearly have not sorted it out enough. It didn't really gel when I came into it. I had it as like a point that I was going to cover. But anyway, this was a long one, and I appreciate you sitting through it. And I hope that this given you some idea of like left and right hand path, like dispelled some of the mythology around them, giving you some like solid understanding to work from. And again, so you're not like, oh, it's the devil or whatever. Like, we will discuss at some point the role of the devil and the other devil that they don't fucking tell you about. And we'll get into all that. Don't worry. This I could literally talk for my entire life about this stuff. It's fucking amazing. Anyway, that's why I'm here. That's why I have this channel. Thank you for listening, all, and have a pleasant time of day, wherever you are.